Council has described as the UK's emergency brake on benefits requires a majority in the European Parliament. Will you and your group be voting for the emergency brake on benefits?
So you can be sure that especially my colleague Jean Lambert, as she always did, will try to achieve as at its best social responsibility on the European level. The idea of the social Europe has its cradle in my group, and Jean Lambert, well known also in the UK context. You can trust in her that she takes care of all the social issues.
Vielen Dank.
I think we can take it that the short answer is probably no. She's not going to vote for it. Incidentally, that obscure German politician is in fact the co-president of the Greens. So in the sort of parallel universe of the European Parliament is sort of faintly important. Anyway, the last time I spoke to a UKIP meeting, I quoted from Frankie Howard. But I'm now going to go a little bit further up the intellectual scale, but not much. I don't know if anybody here remembers Lord of the Rings or has seen any of the films. Now, if you remember, there were 3 volumes all about the ring being destroyed, but almost nothing on what happened after the ring was destroyed. So let's take a look at the UK after Brexit. Let's shed some light onto the so-called leap in the dark. Let's go and dwell for a moment in the sunlit uplands after Brexit. Well, first of all, we will have got democracy back. The only people making our laws will be people we've actually voted for. Our laws and regulations will come from Parliament, not unelected bureaucrats in Brussels. We will regain our voice at the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, and a whole host of other international organizations where our voice has been muted, rendered almost dumb, as one of 28 in the European Union. We will sign trade agreements in our own national interest. The majority of our exports already now go to countries outside the EU, and we will have got back, repatriated the power to negotiate trade agreements from the EU. Under World Trade Organization rules, WTO rules, the UK will get low tariffs on most of its exports, including to the EU, just for example, China, the United States, India, and Brazil do today. We will have re-established the supremacy of our own law, and we will have got back our own waters, which account for more than 2/3 of what the EU calls its waters. Our fishermen will be allowed to fish. Our commerce will no longer suffer unnecessary interference and job-destroying regulations. No longer will waves of unskilled immigrants from Eastern Europe drive down wages so that British people cannot get work. Immigration will be via an Australian-style point system, and that we cannot do at the moment. We will be able to reduce and reform or even abolish VAT, and in any case there will be no more tithe of VAT paid to Brussels. Our customs duties will all go to our own treasury. On regional aid, as has been said earlier, we will pay out where we like, for what we like, and to who we like, with no EU strings attached. And for example, the BBC will get no more EU subsidies. First of all, let's take a look at what we are paying out. I think we should try and have a slide now. I haven't got anything to press it with. These are our membership fees, both direct and indirect. And this comes from Gerard Batten's and Professor Tim Congdon's important pamphlet on the costs of the EU. There's 100 pages backing this up. These add, as Mark Breckles has pointed out, to our balance of payments deficit. We will no longer be paying these. And let me make the essential point that less, significantly less than 15% of our economy trades with people and businesses in the member states of the European Union. Nonetheless, 100% of our economy is subject to EU regulation, which our civil service rigorously enforces, indeed sometimes more so. We've all heard the term gold plating. Outside the EU, the UK will be financially stronger and better off. Now, to trade following Brexit. Some people suggest or imply, bizarrely, that on Brexit, all our trade with the EU will cease. And you'd certainly get this impression if you listened to Mr. Cameron or to Newsnight on BBC Two. So let's look at some real facts. Slide. China, just have a quick look. China exports more goods to the EU than the UK does. And in case anyone's followed my work before, this is new. China has access to the EU markets. And China, Mr. Cameron, is not a member of the EU. Now to the next slide. Switzerland has an economy less than 1/4 the size of ours. Switzerland is not a member of the European Union. Nevertheless, Switzerland exports to the EU more per person than the UK, to the tune of 4.5 times. You can see at the bottom it says 4.6 actually. And this you will not hear from the Prime Minister. And we go to the next slide. The value of the trade of the top 20 non-EU countries trading with the EU was an incredible 2,590 billion euros in 2013. And to illustrate the sheer size of this figure, this is more than the entire economy of France, more than the entire economy of us here in the UK, and it is even more than Tony Blair and Cherry Blair got paid last year. A country does not have to be a member of the European Union for its businesses to trade successfully and have comprehensive access to EU markets. A country does not need to have a trade agreement with the EU to trade with the EU. The three biggest exporters to the EU, the United States, Russia, and China, do not have a trade agreement with the EU. Indeed, 6 of the top 10 and 11 of the top 20 exporters to the EU, actually from the previous slide, do not have trade agreements with the EU. An EU-UK trade agreement post-Brexit is, of course, desirable, but it is not a requirement, far less a precondition, for companies and people to trade successfully and profitably to the EU. Now, slide to the trade agreements that the EU actually does have. The European Union does have over 100 trade agreements with countries outside the European Union. These trade agreements deliver, to a greater or lesser degree, reduced tariffs or tariff-free trade. And that's the list. The European Union has trade agreements with Mexico, Chile, Madagascar, but please note, not with China. We in the UK are the European Union's biggest market. Moreover, we have a large and ever-increasing trade deficit with them. We pay them much more than they pay us. It follows that an EU-UK trade agreement, although it is not actually necessary, nonetheless, in practical terms, it is inevitable. There is a commercial imperative, and this you will not hear from David Cameron. What he does tell us is that any future UK-EU trade agreement would have to have a free movement of people clause. The Prime Minister has been trotting this out all over the country, 2 days ago in Preston, and this is simply not true. Perhaps what the Prime Minister is really saying, that on Brexit, he intends to have another feeble negotiation in order to make this a self-fulfilling prophecy. The facts are as follows, and ladies and gentlemen, this is not Project Fear, this is Project Fact. The EU has, according to how you count them, over 100 trade agreements. The slide you just saw said 140. Out of all these trade agreements, only 4 of them, the EFTA agreements, have a free movement of people clause. Even within Europe, the EU has trade agreements with 10 countries without a free movement of people clause. And these include with Albania, with Bosnia, with Serbia, with Turkey, at least for the time being. Turkey is even in the EU's customs union, and there is no free movement of people clause. And there's no free movement of people from Turkey, although there may well be. And this is what you don't hear from David Cameron. David Cameron is simply deceiving the electorate on this one. And as Prime Minister, he should be heartily ashamed of himself. It demeans the office. It may seem a bit technical, but we're going to hear this over and over and over again, and it's simply untrue. That is, unless the negotiation at the time of Brexit is entirely as feeble as what we've seen before, in which case I hardly ever agree with the leader of the Scottish Nationalists, but it is clearly the case that on Brexit, David Cameron should resign, as he's proved himself entirely feeble, indeed unable to defend the interests of this country. What you do here is the so-called 3 million jobs disappearing with Brexit. This is tendentious nonsense, total tosh. At least 4 million jobs in the European Union do depend on trade with the UK, and we can be absolutely certain that trade will continue. And the only people who will lose their jobs on Brexit are members of the European Parliament, such as myself. That always gets the biggest round of applause. A former president of Israel once said, "People age, dreams are ageless." And we, on our side of the argument, have always had a dream. And our dream is of an independent country that is not a province in a protectionist European superstate. That can rule itself, that is international and outward-looking, that has a full seat on the World Trade Organization, that can make its own choices, that controls its own borders, that has an ethical policy on immigration, that is self-confident. That is our dream, and this dream can come true only on Brexit, when we are, to quote the title of my forthcoming book, out of the EU into the world. But the last word shouldn't come from me. It must come from Winston Churchill, who wrote, "If Britain must choose between Europe and the open sea, she must always choose the open sea."